The most humiliating moment of Loretta Finch's life wasn't when the judge called the courtroom to order. It was when Patrick, her husband of 41 years, reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a worn $2 bill, and slid it across the polished table with the back of his hand, the way someone might brush crumbs from a tablecloth. "That's what you're worth," he said, loud enough for the whole room to go still. $2. The same as everything your father ever built. His family laughed. His young girlfriend looked away to hide her smile. Loretta stood to leave with nothing but her dignity and a piece of old paper. But Solomon Osei, a quiet man in a dark suit she hadn't even noticed slip into the room, was already on his feet, already reaching for his car keys. Because he knew exactly where they needed to go, and he had been waiting 30 years for this moment. In this channel, we believe justice always finds its way to those who hold on, because dreams have no age. Join our community by subscribing now, because today you will discover what Loretta found when Solomon drove her down a gravel road to a farm that nobody knew existed, and how the man who humiliated her had unknowingly handed her the key to a legacy he could never touch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The courtroom on the second floor of the Harwick County Courthouse smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into places where lives are quietly dismantled. It was a Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of gray, windswept day that felt appropriate for endings. Loretta Finch arrived at 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, wearing a burgundy wool blazer she had bought herself 3 Christmases ago and a pair of dark slacks that had been carefully pressed the night before. She carried a small leather portfolio. Nothing inside it of consequence anymore, just a few handwritten notes, a pen, and a photograph of her father that she had slipped in that morning without fully understanding why. She was 69 years old. She had been married to Patrick Finch for 41 years. And today was the day a judge would finalize what those 41 years were legally worth. She took the elevator to the second floor alone. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet except for the sound of her own footsteps and the distant hum of a heating unit working too hard against the November cold. She paused outside the double doors for just a moment, her hand resting on the wood, her eyes closed. She was not praying exactly. She was remembering. The way the kitchen in their first apartment had smelled of coffee and possibility on Sunday mornings. The afternoon Patrick had called her from a payphone, breathless with excitement, to tell her he'd closed his first major business deal, and she had cried with him from pure happiness. The births of Cora and Wesley, both of which Patrick had been late to, one because of a client dinner he hadn't wanted to leave early, one because of a golf weekend he had refused to cut short. The thousands of evenings she had spent managing their household, raising their children, hosting Patrick business associates over dinners she cooked and served and cleaned up alone, maintaining the entire social architecture of a life that had always, she now understood, been built to serve Patrick and no one else. She opened the doors and walked in. Patrick was already there. He was seated at the defendant's table with Gordon Pierce, his attorney, a man of 56 with silver cufflinks and the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades winning in rooms exactly like this one. Patrick himself looked well. He always looked well. He was 71, but money had been generous to him in the way that it is generous to men who know how to use it. Good tailoring, careful grooming, a tan that suggested recent travel somewhere warm. Beside him sat Savannah, his girlfriend of 2 years, a woman of 31 in a cream blouse and dark blazer, who had arranged herself in her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew how this was going to end. Patrick's family had come to watch. His brother Craig sat in the second row with his arms folded in a small, satisfied smirk that he wasn't bothering to conceal. Beside him was Dolores, Patrick's mother, 78 years old, dressed in charcoal gray with pearl earrings, her posture immaculate, her expression carrying the kind of careful blankness that certain women use as a weapon. She had never truly accepted Loretta. Not in 41 years. Not once. She had always been too composed to say it directly, but she had made it felt in 1,000 quiet ways. The slight pause before including Loretta in family photographs. The way she addressed Patrick alone when discussing family matters. The way she had once referred to Loretta in a voice just audible enough to be intentional as the woman Patrick settled for. Renee, Patrick's sister, sat beside Dolores with her husband, both of them exchanging glances in the way that people do when they are anticipating a performance they have already rehearsed in their imagination. Loretta sat alone at the plaintiff's table. Her last attorney had withdrawn from the case 6 weeks earlier when the retainer ran out. She had considered representing herself and had even prepared for it, but the truth was that Patrick's legal team had already won. The paperwork proved it. Properties held in limited liability companies. Investment accounts structured as business assets. Her name absent from documents she had always assumed she was listed on, quietly removed during refinancing proceedings she had never been informed about. Gordon Pierce had been thorough and patient and precise, and by the time Loretta had understood the full shape of what had been done, there was almost nothing left to contest. Judge Helen Briggs entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was in her early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had the manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago, but had not yet allowed herself to stop caring about outcomes. Case number 2025, DR 4412, she said. Finch versus Finch. Final settlement hearing. Gordon Pierce rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom carrying a single sealed envelope. He opened it slowly, removed a sheet of paper, and looked across at Loretta with an expression that contained no hostility at all, which, she had come to understand, was more chilling than hostility would have been. "Your Honor," he said, "my client has been more than reasonable throughout these proceedings. He has extended every professional consideration to the plaintiff despite her complete failure to contribute to the financial foundation of this marriage. After exhaustive review, he is prepared to make a final and complete settlement offer." He paused. "My client offers the plaintiff $2. The courtroom went completely silent. Gordon Pierce reached back into the envelope and removed something small. He held it up between two fingers. A worn, faded $2 bill. Old and clearly handled over many years, its paper soft, its edges slightly frayed and rounded. "Your Honor," he continued, "this bill was pressed into my client's hand by the plaintiff's father, Vernon Hayward, at the couple's engagement dinner 42 years ago." Mr. Hayward pushed it across the table and said, "And I have a witness statement confirming this. This is all I have to give you. Take care of my girl." My client kept it. He considered it a charm, a token of that evening. He now presents it as the most honest accounting of what the plaintiff's family ever brought to this union. $2. That is the complete and final value of what Loretta Hayward contributed to 41 years of marriage. Craig laughed first, then Renee. Dolores did not laugh, but her lips curved into something cold and satisfied, and somehow that was worse than laughter. Patrick stood. He walked to Loretta's table without hurrying, the way a man walks when he is certain of every step. He placed the $2 bill directly in front of her, smoothing it flat against the wood with 2 fingers, and looked down at her with eyes that held nothing she recognized anymore. "Your father always said it was all he had," Patrick said quietly. "Turns out he was telling the truth. And so are you." Loretta looked at the bill. She looked at the man she had loved for 41 years. She reached out to take it, to sign the papers, and to leave this room and never come back. And then a hand closed gently but firmly over her wrist. She turned. Solomon Osei was sitting in the chair directly beside her. She had not seen him enter. He was in his 70s, slight and unhurried, in a dark suit that had been pressed with great care. He had been her father's attorney for nearly 3 decades, handling quiet, modest things, lease reviews, a property dispute, the small legal needs of a man most people had long since written off as nothing more than a simple farmer. He had no role in these proceedings. He had no right to be sitting at this table. But his eyes were fixed on the $2 bill, and his hands were trembling. Loretta Finch was not always the woman sitting alone at a plaintiff's table with no attorney and no assets and a worn $2 bill in front of her. There had been a version of her life, early on, that had felt full of momentum. She had been sharp, curious, and quietly ambitious, the kind of young woman who read everything she could get her hands on and retained it all. She had earned a degree in business administration from a state university, paying for it herself through a combination of scholarships and weekend shifts at a diner 3 miles from campus. She had graduated with honors. She had 2 job offers waiting for her by the time she walked across the stage. She had chosen neither of them. She had chosen Patrick. They had met at a mutual friend's dinner party when Loretta was 27 and Patrick was 29 and newly launched into the world of commercial real estate with all the energy and certainty of a man who had never seriously doubted himself. He was charming in the specific way that certain men are charming, wholly focused on you in the moment, generous with his attention, a listener who made you feel seen. He had told her on their 3rd date that she was the most capable woman he had ever met. He had told her on their 6th date that he needed someone like her in his corner. He had told her the night he proposed that everything he was going to build, he wanted to build with her. She had believed him. She had been 28 years old, and she had believed every word. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What followed was 41 years of a particular kind of erasure that happens so slowly and so quietly that the person it is happening to rarely notices until it is nearly complete. In the early years, the arrangement had seemed sensible enough. Patrick's real estate career required long hours, constant networking, and the kind of social infrastructure that does not build itself. Loretta stepped in. She managed their home. She raised Cora and Wesley through infancy and childhood and adolescence with a level of presence and consistency that neither child would fully appreciate until they were adults themselves. She hosted dinners for Patrick's clients and colleagues, learning the names of their spouses, remembering their children's ages, building the warm and seamless social world that made Patrick appear not just successful but grounded, trustworthy, the kind of man you wanted to do business with. She had set aside her own ambitions gradually, the way you set aside things you intend to return to someday. The business ideas she had quietly sketched in notebooks during the children's nap times. The management position she had been offered at a small firm when Wesley started school, which Patrick had gently discouraged with a logic that had seemed reasonable at the time. They didn't need the money, the hours would be difficult. Who would handle things at home? She had agreed. She had always agreed. Not from weakness, but from a genuine belief that what they were building together was worth the investment of her own ambitions. The truth she would only understand much later was that Patrick had never thought of it as a shared investment. He had thought of it as a transaction. She gave. He kept. By the time their children were grown and gone, Loretta was in her mid-50s and Patrick's business empire was substantial. Properties across 3 counties, a portfolio of commercial leases, equity in several development projects. They had a house they'd lived in for 28 years, a vacation property on a lake 2 hours north, and retirement accounts that Loretta had assumed were jointly held. She had no career of her own, no income in her name, no independent financial identity to speak of. She had poured everything, her time, her education, her professional potential, her social intelligence, into Patrick's world. And Patrick's world had thrived. She had not seen the signs early enough. Looking back, she could identify them. The increasing distance, the trips that seemed to stretch longer than necessary, the phone calls taken in other rooms, the careful way Patrick had begun referring to certain assets as my properties and my accounts in casual conversation, as though the shift in language was simply a matter of habit. She had attributed it to stress, to the pressures of a successful man managing a complicated business. She had been wrong. Patrick had been restructuring everything for years, moving assets into LLCs registered in his name alone, refinancing properties in ways that quietly removed her from the deeds. She later learned, from documents unearthed during the divorce proceedings, that the process had begun nearly a decade before he filed. He had been preparing for a long time. He had been methodical and patient and thorough, And by the time he arrived home one evening when Loretta was 68 and told her he was in love with his assistant and wanted a divorce, the financial architecture he had built to exclude her was already essentially complete. She had stood in their kitchen of 28 years and felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. What came after was 16 months of proceedings that dismantled her remaining certainties one by one. Gordon Pierce and his team were skilled and relentless. Every legal avenue Loretta's attorney tried to pursue hit a carefully constructed wall. Every asset she believed she was entitled to had been structured, years in advance, to be beyond her reach. She watched her life's work disappear on paper, line by line, hearing by hearing, until the morning in late November when she pressed the button for the elevator on the second floor of the Harwood County Courthouse and walked alone into a room where a $2 bill was waiting for her. What Patrick had not accounted for, what none of them had accounted for, was Solomon Osei sitting quietly in the back of that courtroom with his hands folded in his lap and 30 years of patience running through him like a current. Solomon Osei had known Vernon Hayward for 31 years. They had met the way most people in small towns meet the people who matter most to them, by accident and proximity and the slow accumulation of shared time. Vernon had come into Solomon's modest law office on Granger Street one February morning, needing help with a lease dispute on a piece of farmland he had been working for years. He was a tall man, spare and weathered, with hands that looked like they had never in his life been idle and eyes that were considerably sharper than most people gave him credit for. Solomon had resolved the dispute in 2 weeks. Vernon had shaken his hand at the end of it, looked at him with those careful eyes, and said simply, "You're a fair man. I'd like to keep working with you, if that's all right." It had been all right. It had been, over the years, something considerably more than all right. Vernon Hayward was the kind of man who became invisible in the way that working men sometimes become invisible. Not because he lacked substance, but because the world around him had decided, without asking, that men who worked with their hands and kept to themselves and drove old trucks and lived on modest farmland had no interior life worth examining. People saw what they expected to see: a farmer, a handyman, a quiet man of no particular consequence. They saw the surface and stopped there. Solomon had never stopped there. And over the years, through careful conversations in his office and occasional cups of coffee on Vernon's porch, he had come to understand that the man everyone had written off was one of the most deliberate and quietly brilliant people he had ever encountered. Vernon had spoken about Loretta often, always with a kind of pride that was too deep to be demonstrative. Not the proud boasting of a father who wanted credit, but the steady, certain pride of a man who knew exactly what he had raised and was content to let the world discover it in its own time. He had spoken about Patrick too, though less often and with a reserve that Solomon had learned to read carefully. Vernon had never said anything directly critical of his son-in-law. He had simply watched and noticed and said very little, in a way that perceptive people sometimes do when they understand that what they see cannot yet be proven and must instead be prepared for. It was during one of those conversations, nearly 30 years ago, that Vernon had told Solomon what he had been building. Not all of it at once. It came in pieces, over months, and then years, the full shape of it only becoming clear gradually, the way a landscape becomes clear as fog lifts. Solomon had listened to all of it. He had helped structure parts of it. He had filed certain documents and maintained certain records and kept certain keys, and he had waited because Vernon had asked him to wait, and because he trusted Vernon's judgment in the way that you trust the judgment of someone who has never once been wrong about anything that mattered. Vernon's instruction had been specific and unambiguous. He had written it down and had Solomon witness it formally. If Loretta was ever left with nothing, if she was ever publicly humiliated by the people who had never believed she was enough, if she was ever made to feel, in any official and final way, that her life's worth could be reduced to a number and handed to her across a table, then, and only then, was Solomon to act. He had been watching the divorce proceedings from a distance for 16 months. He had read the filings. He had tracked the hearings. He had waited to see whether things would resolve differently, whether some last intervention of fairness would render his involvement unnecessary. It had not come. And so on the morning of the final hearing, he had dressed carefully, driven to the Harwick County Courthouse, taken the elevator to the second floor, and slipped quietly into the back of the courtroom, where he had sat with his hands folded and watched Patrick Finch slide a $2 bill across a table toward the woman who had given him 4 decades of her life. He had seen Gordon Pierce perform his little theater with the envelope. He had watched Craig laugh and Dolores smile and Savannah look away. He had watched Patrick lean over Loretta and speak quietly to her with the absolute confidence of a man who had already won. And he had waited until Loretta reached for the bill, until her fingers were almost touching it, until the moment was as complete and final and documented as it could possibly be. Then he had closed his hand gently over her wrist and sat down beside her and asked Judge Helen Briggs for a 10-minute recess. The judge had looked at him for a long moment. She had seen something in his expression, not urgency exactly, but a quality of settled certainty that is rarer and more compelling than urgency. She had granted the recess without requiring him to explain himself further. Gordon Pierce had objected immediately, his composure cracking just slightly at the edges for the first time that morning. Patrick had turned in his chair to look at Solomon with an expression that was not quite worry yet, but was the thing that comes just before worry, the first small fracture in the architecture of certainty. Solomon had not looked at Patrick. He had simply guided Loretta by the elbow out of the courtroom and into a narrow conference room at the end of the hallway, where he had set his briefcase on the table and opened it with the unhurried movements of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for 3 decades. He placed 3 things on the table. The first was a folded letter in Vernon Hayward's handwriting. The second was a heavy iron key on a plain metal ring. The third was a photograph, old, slightly faded, of a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by fields that stretched to a tree line in the distance, taken on a bright summer morning sometime in the late 1980s. Loretta looked at the photograph. She looked at Solomon. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "That's my father's farm," she said. "He sold that place years ago. I watched him sign the papers." Solomon shook his head slowly. "He didn't sell it," Solomon said. "He transferred it into a trust, in your name. And what's on that farm, Loretta, what your father spent his whole life building there, is something Patrick's lawyers are never going to find a way to touch." Loretta sat in the conference room for a long moment after Solomon spoke. She looked at the photograph of the farmhouse, the white paint weathered to a soft gray, the oak tree at the corner of the porch that she remembered climbing as a child, the long fields rolling out behind the house toward the distant tree line, and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. It was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite hope. It was something older than any of those things, something that belonged to a specific place in memory that she had not visited in a very long time. She had been 12 years old the last time she had felt truly safe. Her mother had been alive then, and the farm had been the whole world, not a large world, not a wealthy one, but complete in the way that only certain places are complete, places where every corner holds something familiar and every sound belongs. After her mother died, the farm had changed in quality without changing in appearance. Her father had kept it going, kept working it, kept the fences mended and the fields tended, but something in the atmosphere of the place had shifted. Vernon Hayward had become quieter, more inward, more deliberate. He had directed his grief, as far as Loretta could tell, into work, into building, into a project she had never fully understood. She understood now that she had never been meant to understand it until this moment. "We need to go back in," Solomon said gently. "We need to accept the settlement. The $2. The $2, he confirmed. "We need that bill, Loretta. Patrick doesn't know what it is. He kept it as a trophy for 42 years without understanding what your father had done to it. We need it signed over to you officially on the record in front of the judge." Loretta looked at him. "What did my father do to it?" Solomon allowed himself a small, careful smile. He wrote on it, "The night of your engagement dinner, after Patrick's family had gone home and your father had come back to his farmhouse and sat down at his kitchen table and thought very carefully about the kind of people he had just met. He took that bill, the same one Patrick had waved around so proudly, the grand gesture of a man who thought $2 was a generous tip to a poor farmer's daughter, and he wrote on it in pencil. The coordinates of the farm, the combination to a lockbox inside the main structure. And one sentence. What sentence? You'll see it when we get there. He began gathering his papers. First, the courtroom. They returned to find Patrick standing near the window with his arms crossed and an expression that had shifted almost imperceptibly from triumph to something more guarded. Craig had stopped smiling. Dolores sat with her handbag in her lap, and her eyes moving between Solomon and the door with the careful attention of a woman who had not survived 78 years without developing a reliable instinct for when something had changed. Judge Briggs reconvened the hearing. "Miss Finch," she said, looking at Loretta directly, "having had the opportunity to consult with your counsel, do you have a response to the settlement offer currently before the court?" Loretta stood. Solomon stood beside her. "Your Honor," Loretta said, her voice steady and clear in a way that surprised even her, "I accept the $2 settlement." The reaction from Patrick's side of the courtroom was immediate and unrestrained. Craig actually clapped once. Renee covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes bright with delight. Savannah leaned close to Patrick and said something that made him laugh, a short, satisfied sound that carried across the room. Dolores uncrossed and recrossed her ankles with the composure of a woman receiving exactly the news she had come to receive. Gordon Pierce moved efficiently, producing the settlement documents from his briefcase with a smoothness that suggested he had prepared them well in advance. Loretta signed each page where indicated, her handwriting careful and deliberate. When the final signature was done and the papers were collected and filed, and the judge had spoken the words that made it legal and permanent, Gordon Pierce picked up the $2 bill from the table and held it out to Loretta with a look of polished courtesy that didn't quite conceal the satisfaction beneath it. "Your settlement," he said. Loretta took it from him without expression. She held it in both hands for just a moment, looking at it. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her burgundy blazer, close to her chest, the way her father might have folded something worth keeping. She looked at Patrick one last time across the courtroom. He was already turning away. "Thank you," she said quietly, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Outside the courthouse, the November air was sharp and clean after the stale warmth of the courtroom. Solomon walked beside her down the front steps to the parking lot without speaking. His car was a dark green sedan of a certain age, well-maintained, unhurried, a car that suited him entirely. He opened the passenger door for her, waited until she was settled, then walked around and got behind the wheel. He did not immediately start the engine. "Before we go," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, "there's something your father wanted you to have at this specific moment. Not later. Now." He placed a small envelope on the console between them. Her name was written on the front in Vernon Hayward's careful hand. Not Loretta Finch. Loretta Hayward. Her name. Her own name. She opened it. Inside was a single index card. For words, written in pencil in her father's meticulous printing. "Drive with me. Come home." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Solomon started the engine. They drove south out of Harwood County on the state highway for about 20 minutes before Solomon turned onto a county road, and then again onto a smaller road, and then finally onto a gravel lane that Loretta recognized with the particular shock of encountering something from your own memory in the physical world. The oak tree was still there. The porch was still there, its boards weathered and gray but solid. The field stretched out on both sides, dormant in November but clearly tended. The fences intact, the drainage channels clear, the soil dark and well-turned along the edges where the season's work had recently been done. "Someone has been maintaining this," Loretta said slowly. "Yes," Solomon said. "Someone has been maintaining it for 30 years. Your father made arrangements. After he passed, the trust continued the work. There are 2 people who have worked this land since before your father died, and they are still here. They knew this day would come." He stopped the car at the end of the lane in front of the farmhouse and turned off the engine. The silence of the place came in through the windows, the particular rural silence that is not actually silence at all, but a texture of wind and distance, and living things going about their business without reference to human trouble. Loretta looked at her father's house. She looked at the fields. She looked at the key in Solomon's hand, which he was now holding out to her. "The main structure is behind the house," he said. "Your father built it himself over the course of about 5 years. Most people who came to the farm assumed it was a storage barn. It is not a storage barn." He paused. "Are you ready?" Loretta took the key. "Tell me one thing first," she said. "Anything. Did Patrick's lawyers ever find this place? During the proceedings?" Solomon shook his head. "They searched his financial records, his known assets, his disclosed properties. The farm was transferred into the trust before you married Patrick. It has never appeared in any document connected to either of your names. It is completely and legally invisible to anything they were looking for." Loretta nodded slowly. She opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel, and the cold November air came around her like something old and familiar and entirely her own. She walked toward the farmhouse. Behind it, in the near distance, a large timber-framed structure stood with its doors closed against the season, solid and waiting, exactly as her father had left it. The structure behind the farmhouse was larger than it appeared from the lane. Up close, it was clearly and deliberately built, not thrown together the way working outbuildings often are, but constructed with the kind of careful precision that takes years and intention and a very specific vision of what the finished thing needs to be. The timber framing was solid oak, fitted and joined with the exactness of a man who understood with the way a musician understands an instrument. The roof was steel, newer than the walls, and clearly replaced within the last decade. The foundation was poured concrete, deep and level, the kind that does not shift with frost. Someone had cared about this building for a very long time. There was a door at the front, wide and heavy, fitted with a padlock that was not old. Solomon had been replacing it every few years. Loretta inserted the iron key. The lock turned cleanly, with the well-maintained ease of a mechanism that had been regularly attended to, and the door swung inward on balanced hinges without resistance. The first thing that reached her was the smell, dry and complex and layered, earth and timber and something green and living underneath it, a botanical richness that shouldn't have been possible in a closed structure on a cold November morning. She stepped inside. The interior was divided into 3 sections. The first, nearest the door, held floor-to-ceiling shelving units, constructed from the same careful joinery as the building itself. On the shelves were hundreds of sealed glass containers, jars of varying sizes, each one labeled in her father's handwriting in a system of letters and numbers she did not immediately understand. Beside the shelves stood a row of flat wooden drawers, the kind used in seed libraries, each one labeled and dated. Loretta pulled one open slowly. Inside, sorted into individual paper envelopes, were seeds. Hundreds of them. Each envelope marked with a name, a date, a location of origin. She moved into the second section. Here the ceiling was higher, fitted with a ventilation system of obvious sophistication. Not the crude kind cobbled together from hardware store parts, but something engineered, with multiple intake and exhaust points, humidity sensors, temperature gauges mounted at intervals along the walls. Along one side of this section ran a long workbench covered with journals. Dozens of them, identical dark green notebooks stacked in careful rows, dated on the spines in chronological order beginning in 1974 and running through to the year of Vernon's death. Every page of every notebook was filled with her father's precise handwriting. Observations, measurements, diagrams, notes on growing conditions, on cross-pollination results, on soil composition, on the particular behaviors of specific plant varieties across specific seasons in this specific piece of land. The third section held the lockbox. It was set into the concrete floor beneath a hinged wooden panel that Loretta found only because Solomon showed her where to look. The box itself was fireproof steel, combination locked. She consulted the $2 bill, reading the numbers her father had written in pencil in the lower margin 42 years ago. The numbers Patrick had carried in his breast pocket for 4 decades as a monument to his own contempt, never once thinking to look at what else was written there. She dialed the combination. The lock released. Inside the box was a leather folder, and on top of it a letter. She picked up the letter. She recognized the stationery. Her father had used the same pale blue paper for as long as she could remember, bought in packages of 50 from the same stationery store in town that had closed sometime in the 90s. His handwriting was steady and clear, with none of the tremor that illness had introduced in his final months. He had written this early. She read it aloud. Solomon stood behind her in the quiet of the building and listened. "My dear Loretta, if you are reading this, then the moment I spent 30 years preparing for has arrived, and I want you to know something before you open that folder. Everything in this building, everything I built and documented and protected, was built for you. Not as a safety net, not as a rescue, as a statement, as proof that I always knew what you were worth, even when the people around you did not. When I came to this land, I was a farmer's son with a borrowed truck and soil under my fingernails that I couldn't get entirely clean no matter how long I scrubbed. People made certain assumptions about me based on those things, and I let them because I had learned early that invisible men can build things that visible men cannot. I spent 50 years on this land watching, experimenting, recording, and creating. What I discovered, I documented. What I documented, I protected. In this folder, you will find patents for 23 plant varieties I developed over the course of my life on this farm. Drought-resistant strains of crops that grow reliably in soil types most agricultural scientists considered too depleted to be viable. 3 of them have already been licensed to agricultural companies operating across the Midwest and the South. The licensing agreements are ironclad, and they are structured to pay royalties to the trust, your trust, for the remaining life of each patent. The farm itself holds the only existing seed bank for 11 of these varieties, which means that the land you are standing on is not just sentimentally valuable. It is scientifically irreplaceable. I want to tell you something about that $2 bill. When Patrick pressed it into my hand at your engagement dinner like a man tipping a parking attendant, I smiled and thanked him. And then I drove home and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at that bill for a long time. I looked at it and I thought about the kind of man who would do that and the kind of family that raised him, and I made myself a promise. I took a pencil and I wrote on that bill very carefully, and then the next time I was in Harwick, I returned it to Patrick's jacket pocket while he wasn't looking. I knew he would keep it. Men like that always keep their trophies. I also knew that someday he would use it to hurt you, and I knew that the moment he handed it to you would be the moment it became yours. I planned for that day, my daughter. I planned for it the way a farmer plans for a season that hasn't come yet, with patience and with faith, and with a great deal of quiet work in the meantime. The current valuation of the trust assets, as of the last independent assessment conducted 18 months ago, is $9.4 million. With continuing royalties and ongoing licensing negotiations for the 3 newest varieties, that number is expected to grow substantially. Every cent of it is legally and completely yours. No court on earth can reach it. I made certain of that. You are never worth $2, Loretta. You are never worth the small opinion that small people had of you or of me. You are always worth everything. I just needed you to arrive at the place where you could receive it. I love you more than I ever managed to say properly. I always meant to get better at saying it. Your father, Vernon Hayward. Loretta lowered the letter. She did not immediately speak. The building was quiet around her, the ventilation system moving air gently through the space her father had built with his own hands over 5 patient years, the seed drawers holding their careful contents, the green journals stacked in their rows, 40 years of a man's inner life documented in precise and loving detail, while the world outside walked past him and saw only a farmer. She sat down on the floor of the building and put her face in her hands and wept, not from grief, or not from grief alone, from the particular overwhelming quality of being entirely and unexpectedly seen by someone who had known all along who you were and had spent their whole life making sure that knowledge was protected. Solomon sat down in a wooden chair near the workbench and said nothing. He had waited 30 years for this moment. He was content to let it be what it needed to be. After a while, Loretta stood. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up the leather folder and opened it and began to read. $9.4 million, 23 patents, 11 irreplaceable seed varieties, a trust structured to be legally unreachable by any claim Patrick Finch or his attorneys could conceivably construct. Her father, The quiet farmer that everyone had looked through without seeing, had built her a fortress out of seeds and patience and love. The news moved through Patrick Finch's social world the way all genuinely surprising news moves. First as rumor, then as whispered confirmation, then as the kind of established fact that people repeat to each other with the particular energy of those who enjoy watching a confident man discover he miscalculated. Within 2 weeks of the final settlement hearing, the broad outline of what had happened was known among the people who mattered to Patrick professionally and socially. The details came later, and the details were worse. Loretta Finch, the woman Patrick had publicly settled with $2 in a county courthouse on a Tuesday morning in November, was independently wealthy. Not modestly comfortable. Not adequately provided for. Wealthy in the quiet, legally unassailable way that is the most unsettling kind of wealthy, because it carries with it none of the vulnerability that money acquired through obvious means usually carries. The trust her father had built was not connected to any transaction Patrick had ever been part of, was not influenced by any financial decision made during their marriage, and was entirely beyond the reach of any legal argument his attorneys could construct. It simply existed, had always existed, and was now fully and formally hers. Patrick did not accept this information gracefully. His first response was to call Gordon Pierce at 7 in the morning 2 days after he learned the full scope of what had happened, and to instruct him to file a motion challenging the legitimacy of the trust on the grounds that assets accumulated during a marriage should be subject to marital property review. Gordon Pierce, to his credit, told Patrick directly that no such argument would survive a preliminary hearing. The trust had been established before the marriage. The farm had been transferred before the marriage. Every patent had been filed before the marriage. Vernon Hayward had structured everything with a precision that suggested he had consulted not just Solomon Osei, but a very clear understanding of exactly how family law worked and exactly where its limits were. There was no thread to pull. There was no seam to find. Patrick instructed him to file the motion anyway. It was dismissed in 11 days. The ruling was 3 sentences long. The judge did not appear to have found the argument difficult to resolve. Patrick then hired a second firm, a larger one from the city, at considerable expense, and asked them to review the trust documentation for any structural weakness that Gordon Pierce might have missed. They came back 4 weeks later with a report that was detailed and thorough and reached the same conclusion that Gordon Pierce had reached in a single phone call. The trust was sound. The patents were valid. The licensing agreements were properly executed. The farm and everything on it belonged to Loretta Hayward without condition or complication. Patrick did not take that news well either. What followed over the subsequent months was the specific and painful process of a man discovering that the certainty he had built his personality around was not as solid as he had believed. His professional reputation, which he had always considered one of his primary assets, began to show stress fractures in ways that were difficult to address directly because they operated through the informal channels of reputation. The client who didn't return a call, the partner who seemed less available than before, the deal that moved forward without him after he had assumed his involvement was settled. Word had gotten out about the courtroom, about the $2, about the nature of the gesture and the company that had come to watch it performed. There are certain things a man can do in his professional life that can be explained away or forgotten. There are others that attach themselves to his name permanently, and the image of a 71-year-old man sliding $2 across a table toward his wife of 41 years while his family laughed was not the kind of image that professional associates found easy to set aside. Cora and Wesley, Loretta's children, had not spoken to their father since the morning of the hearing. Cora had called him the evening of that day, her voice controlled in the specific way of someone who is managing a great deal of emotion through considerable effort, and told him that she had watched what he did in that courtroom and that she needed time before she could speak to him without it becoming something she would regret. Wesley had not called at all. Patrick had sent messages to both of them that went unanswered for weeks and then months, and the silence that accumulated in place of responses was its own kind of verdict. Savannah, the young woman for whom Patrick had ended his marriage, had moved out of his apartment by spring. The departure was not dramatic. She had simply, over the course of several weeks, redistributed her presence in the apartment until it was mostly absent, and then one day she was entirely gone. Patrick had not seen the specific moment coming despite having every reason to, which was perhaps characteristic of a man who had spent his life being confidently wrong about the inner lives of women. Dolores called him on a Sunday in March and told him in her composed and careful way that she thought he had handled the situation poorly from a strategic standpoint. This was as close as Dolores came to moral criticism. Patrick had told her he didn't want to discuss it. She had said, "I imagine not," and changed the subject, and something in the flatness of those 3 words had stayed with him in a way he couldn't entirely account for. What Patrick had not anticipated, what none of them had anticipated, not Craig with his folded arms, or Renee with her phone, or Dolores with her pearl earrings, was that the cruelty they had performed so publicly and so confidently in that courtroom would not be forgotten by the people who had witnessed it. The court observers who had been present that morning had talked. The bailiff had talked. A junior associate at Gordon Pierce's firm had told the story at a dinner party, thinking it was funny, and the woman sitting across from him had not found it funny at all and had told several people. And the story had continued moving through the social and professional world of Harwood County with the quiet persistence of a true thing that people feel compelled to repeat. Patrick Finch had wanted that morning in the courthouse to be the final word on what Loretta was worth. Instead, it had become the final word on what he was. Loretta, for her part, was not watching any of this with particular attention. She had moved out of the studio apartment she had been renting during the proceedings and into the farmhouse, which Solomon had arranged to have quietly and carefully restored over the previous 18 months in anticipation of exactly this outcome. The kitchen had been updated. The heating system had been replaced. The porch boards had been repaired. The oak tree at the corner was as it had always been. She had unpacked her things into the bedroom that had been hers as a child and sat on the edge of the bed in the late afternoon light and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her daughter Cora came to see the farm on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the hearing. She stood in the doorway of the timber structure and looked at the seed shelves and the green journals and the ventilation system her grandfather had designed and installed himself, and she was quiet for a long time. "I never knew him," she said finally. "Not really. I thought I did, but I only knew the surface of him." "Most people did," Loretta said. "He preferred it that way. He built all of this for you. He built all of this because he loved me, and he understood something about the world that I didn't understand until today." What did he understand? Loretta looked around the building, at her father's life's work arranged with care on its shelves, at 40 years of journals, at the seeds that carried the genetics of plants no other collection on earth held. That the people who underestimate you are only dangerous if you let their opinion of you become your opinion of you, she said. He never let anyone's opinion of him become his opinion of himself. Not once. And so he just kept building. Loretta spent the first 3 months after the settlement doing something she had not done in a very long time. She rested. Not the hollow, anxious rest of someone waiting for the next blow to land, but genuine rest. The kind that comes when a person finally arrives somewhere safe and allows their body to remember what safety feels like. She walked the fields in the mornings with a cup of coffee and learned the names of the plant varieties her father had documented. She read his journals in the evenings by the fireplace in the farmhouse sitting room, starting from the earliest ones dated 1974, and worked her way forward through 50 years of a man's careful observations about soil and seed and season and the particular stubbornness of living things that refuse to stop growing in conditions that should, by any reasonable measure, have defeated them. She found herself in those journals in ways she had not expected. Her father had written about her often, not sentimentally, but with the same precise attention he brought to everything else he documented. He had recorded the milestones of her life alongside the milestones of his crops with a matter-of-fact tenderness that was entirely characteristic of him. Her first day of school appeared in the same entry as a note about the germination rate of an early drought-resistant barley strain. Her graduation was recorded beside observations about a particularly successful growing season. Her marriage to Patrick was noted briefly, without comment, followed by a single line that she read 3 times before she fully absorbed it. The soil here is good. I will keep working it. He had always known. He had simply chosen to keep working. By spring, Loretta was ready to do something with what she had been given. She had spent the winter consulting with Solomon, with agricultural scientists from the state university who had been contacted about Vernon's seed collection, and with a trust attorney recommended by Solomon, who specialized in the kind of philanthropic structuring that her father's legacy both required and deserved. What emerged from those conversations was a plan that felt, when she finally held a hole in her mind, less like something she had designed and more like something she had uncovered, as though the shape of it had been waiting in the work her father had already done, and all she needed to do was recognize it. She established the Vernon Hayward Agricultural Trust. Its primary function was the preservation and ethical stewardship of the seed varieties her father had spent his life developing, ensuring that the 11 irreplaceable strains held in the farm seed library would be maintained, studied, and made available to small-scale farmers and agricultural researchers working in regions where soil depletion and drought had made conventional farming increasingly unviable. The trust also provided grants to first-generation farmers and rural inventors who lacked the resources to file and defend patents for their own innovations. People who, like Vernon, were doing genuinely important work in conditions that made them effectively invisible to the institutions designed to recognize and protect such work. The farm itself was transformed gradually and without haste. 2 agricultural researchers from the university came to spend a season documenting Vernon's journals and cataloging the seed library, and what they found over the course of those months exceeded what anyone outside of Solomon had anticipated. Vernon's drought-resistant strains were not simply viable alternatives to conventional crops. 3 of them demonstrated yield rates in depleted soil conditions that exceeded anything currently available through commercial seed suppliers by margins significant enough to draw serious attention from agricultural departments in 4 states. His ventilation and humidity control system, which he had designed and built himself using salvage components and hand-drawn engineering diagrams found in the later journals, was assessed by a mechanical engineer from the university as representing a genuinely original approach to controlled environment seed storage that had independent applications beyond the farm. A researcher named Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, who led the university's plant genetics division and had spent her career working on food security in drought-affected regions, came to the farm in June and spent 3 days in the timber structure with Vernon's journals and his seeds. On the 3rd day, she sat across the kitchen table from Loretta and told her that what Vernon Hayward had built in that building over 50 years was, without exaggeration, one of the most significant private contributions to agricultural resilience science she had encountered in 20 years of work in the field. He had no institutional support, Dr. Okonkwo said, no university affiliation, no research grants, no peer review. He did this entirely alone, with his own resources, on his own land, driven entirely by his own understanding of what the problems were and what the solutions might be. That was how he did everything, Loretta said. The scientific community needs to know about this work. His name needs to be in the literature. Then let's make sure it is. The process of formally documenting and publishing Vernon's findings, with Dr. Okonkwo leading a research team and Loretta providing full access to the journals and the seed library, took the better part of a year. The resulting papers, published across 3 peer-reviewed agricultural journals, generated a response in the scientific community that was immediate and substantial. Vernon Hayward, the farmer from Harwood County whom nobody had thought to look at twice, was suddenly being discussed in academic departments and agricultural policy circles as a figure whose contributions to drought-resistant crop development had preceded and in several cases anticipated findings that institutional researchers had arrived at decades later through considerably greater resources. Wesley, Loretta's son, drove out to the farm on a Sunday morning in September to find his mother sitting on the porch reading the advance copy of the first published paper with Dr. Okonkwo's covering letter folded in her lap. He sat down beside her, without speaking, and she handed him the paper and watched his face as he read it. He was quiet for a long time afterward. "Grandpa figured this out in a field," he said finally, "with no funding and no team and no recognition. With a borrowed truck and soil under his fingernails," Loretta said. That's all he started with. And Dad thought he was worth $2. Loretta was quiet for a moment. The fields beyond the porch were green in the September light. The drought-resistant barley her father had developed moving gently in a morning wind, alive and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the opinions of people who had never understood what they were looking at. Your grandfather wasn't working for their recognition, she said at last. He was working for something that would outlast their opinion of him. That's a completely different motivation, and it produces completely different results. Wesley looked at the fields. He looked at the paper in his hands. He looked at his mother on the porch of the farmhouse her father had built and left for her in the only way he knew how, quietly, completely, with decades of patient work and not a single wasted gesture. I want to be involved, Wesley said, with the trust, with whatever comes next. I want to help. Loretta smiled. It was a full smile, unhurried, the kind that had been increasingly available to her since November. Your grandfather would have liked that, she said. He always said the work isn't finished until someone carries it forward. 2 years after the morning in the Harwood County Courthouse, Loretta Finch drove herself to the cemetery on a clear October afternoon with a bunch of late-season wildflowers from the farm's east field and a copy of the most recent annual report from the Vernon Hayward Agricultural Trust folded in her coat pocket. The drive took 18 minutes. She had made it many times since moving back to the farm, sometimes with purpose and sometimes simply because she wanted to be near the place where her father's name was carved into stone and the world was quiet enough to think clearly. She parked at the cemetery gate and walked the familiar path between the older headstones to the modest granite marker her father had paid for himself, characteristically, years before he needed it. She placed the wildflowers at the base, sat down on the grass without caring about the cold or the damp, and unfolded the annual report across her knees. The numbers were different from the ones she had found in the lockbox on that November morning. They were larger. The trust had grown in ways that even Solomon, who was not given to underestimating Vernon's foresight, had not fully anticipated. The 3 licensing agreements already in place at the time of the settlement had generated consistent royalties, and 2 new agreements had been signed in the preceding 12 months with agricultural companies operating in regions where drought conditions had made Vernon's seed varieties not merely academically interesting, but practically urgent. The farm itself had become a working research site, partnered formally with the state university and visited regularly by researchers from 3 other institutions and 2 international agricultural organizations. She told her father about all of it. She talked the way people talk to the dead when they are alone and the afternoon is clear and there is no one nearby to observe them, and they have stopped caring anyway, whether they appear entirely composed. She told him about the trust and the researchers and Dr. Okonkwo's second published paper, which had been cited 14 times in the 6 months since its release. She told him about Wesley, who had taken a formal role with the Trust grant program and was proving, as she had always believed he would, to be quietly and seriously good at the work. She told him about Cora, who had brought her own children to the farm twice now and who had stood in the timber structure the second time with her eldest daughter, a girl of 11 who had asked careful questions about the seed drawers and listened to the answers with an attention that had made Loretta's chest ache with recognition. She told him about Patrick, not because she had been tracking Patrick's circumstances or because his situation occupied any significant portion of her attention, but because she thought her father deserved to know how the story had resolved. Patrick's business had contracted significantly in the 2 years since the hearing. Several long-standing professional relationships had ended quietly, in the way that professional relationships sometimes end when a person's reputation has shifted in ways that cannot be directly addressed. He was still operating, still present in the professional world of Harwood County, but at a diminished scale that bore little resemblance to the confident architecture of wealth and influence he had presented in that courtroom. She did not say this with satisfaction. She said it the way you report a fact that confirms something you already knew, that a life built on the humiliation of others is not a stable structure, that cruelty presented as triumph has a way of becoming neither. She thought about the $2 bill. It was in a frame now, hanging in the farmhouse kitchen on the wall, beside the window that looked out over the fields. Solomon had suggested framing it, and she had agreed immediately. because it seemed right that it should be visible and permanent, a daily reminder of the mechanism by which her father's love had finally reached her. The pencil numbers were still there in the lower margin, faint but legible. Her father's sevens crossed in the European style he had never abandoned. His eights formed in two careful circles, stacked one on the other. 42 years of being carried in Patrick's breast pocket as a monument to contempt. And in the end, it had been the key to everything. She had thought many times about the specific genius of that gesture. Her father had understood something that required a very precise kind of intelligence to understand, that a certain type of man will keep his trophies indefinitely, that arrogance is its own form of faithfulness, and that the surest way to deliver something to someone who needs it is to put it in the hands of someone who will guard it carefully without knowing what it is. Patrick had been the safest place in the world to keep that bill, because Patrick would never in 1,000 years have imagined that the farmer he had tipped $2 at an engagement dinner had outsmarted him before he had even finished the gesture. She placed her hand on the cold granite of her father's headstone. "They're putting your seeds in the ground in 4 states this spring, Dad," she said. "Farmers who couldn't grow anything on their land before your varieties. Families who are going to have harvests because of something you figured out alone in a field with a notebook and a borrowed truck." She paused. "I think about you every morning when I walk those fields. I think about what it must have taken to keep going that quietly for that long, with no recognition, no validation, no one telling you that what you were doing mattered. Just the work and the belief that it did." A wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the smell of turned earth and dried leaves, the particular smell of October in that part of the country that she had known since childhood. "It mattered," she said. "It mattered more than anyone knew. And now everyone knows." She stood. She brushed the grass from her coat. She folded the annual report and put it back in her pocket. She looked at the headstone one more time, at her father's name, at the dates that bracketed a life that had been considerably larger than it appeared from the outside, and she allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. Not for the money, though the money had changed everything in the practical sense. Not for the justice, though the justice had been real and complete. For the love. For the specific and extraordinary love of a man who had looked at his daughter and seen not what she was in the present tense, but what she was capable of becoming, and had spent his whole life building toward that capacity rather than toward his own comfort or recognition or ease. That was the inheritance. The $2 had been the delivery mechanism. The inheritance was the love behind it, and the 40 years of patient work that love had generated, and the proof, irrefutable, legally documented, scientifically validated, permanently recorded, that she had always been worth protecting. Loretta Finch was 71 years old. She had lost 4 decades to a man who had seen her as a transaction. But she had the farm and the fields and the seeds and her father's journals and her children and the work of the trust stretching out ahead of her into a future she had not imagined 18 months ago and could not now imagine being without. She got in her car and drove back down the county road toward the farm, toward the oak tree and the porch and the timber structure full of her father's life's work, toward the kitchen where the $2 bill hung framed on the wall beside the window, toward everything that had been waiting for her all along. Some fortresses are built from stone and money and legal structures, and some are built from seeds and notebooks and a father's refusal to let the world's opinion of him become the final word on his daughter's worth. Vernon Hayward had known the difference. He had spent 50 years proving it, and the woman he had built it all for was going home. They thought a $2 bill was the end of her story. It was the first sentence of the one that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.